a.m. So we are going to begin our third leg of this trilogy of WIOA eligibility webinars. The first one was on Thursday, the 10th of September, and in that we covered WIOA general eligibility, which was authorized to work in the United States, compliance with Selective Service, and we included the details about the Selective Service locally approved waivers that are needed if a guy did not register with Selective Service, and we spoke about Veterans Priority of Service. And then on that Thursday, September 10th, we also covered low income. And then on Monday, the 14th of September, we conducted a block on WIOA adult eligibility, including going over the priorities for folks that are basic skills deficient or low income, that are the two priorities beyond Veterans Priority of Service for the adult title, and then we spoke about the youth title. So today is the finale of it. It's going to be on dislocated worker eligibility for the first block, and then after we get finished with that, we'll open up for any questions, and then the final block is going to be a new block, and it's on WIOA legislatively mandated follow-up services once a client is completed with services. So there's some new policies that came out from Commerce on those topics, so I put together this new presentation, so hopefully it goes over well. So as we'll begin here, again, this is the WIOA dislocated worker eligibility. There's a lot of different legislative background guidance that's put out by Department of Labor with the legislation of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act of 2014 that became effective July 1st of 2015. And then the most recent guidance from DOL is Training and Employment Guidance Letter, TEGL 1916, which provides guidance on the adult and dislocated worker title. And it was put out by Department of Labor back in March of 2017, but it is the most current guidance. So if you're not familiar with that TEGL and you work with the adult or dislocated worker, I highly encourage you to get a copy of that and look at it. There's a lot of good information. For commerce policies, we have the general eligibility, which spoke about those issues that I talked about, authorized to work, compliance with Selective Service. We also have the Selective Service policies alone, and then the dislocated worker policy, which we'll spend a lot of time discussing today. So prior to this presentation on dislocated worker, it is advised that you view and understand the details that were covered in the 9/10, so the last Thursday, the 10th of September presentation on WIOA general eligibility. If for some reason why you did not view that, you want to go back because it hits a lot about the Selective Service and especially the waivers that we won't talk about in detail today. But some important information if you didn't get to attend that one last Thursday the 10th. For general eligibility, again, all clients must be authorized to work in the United States, and you should be looking for an unencumbered ability to work in the United States, meaning if they have restrictions. An example I use often in training is it was a dislocated worker, and a guy was authorized to work in the United States, and he was from Canada, but he was only authorized to work at one company in the United States, and he got laid off from that company. He was eligible to draw UI benefits, but if somebody would have brought him in to WIOA services and served him when it came time to get a job, he was not eligible to work for any company except the one that laid him off. So you'd then have a client that's not eligible to work in the United States, so it would be impossible to get outcomes. So you have to be looking to make sure that they have an unencumbered ability to work in the United States. And then the second general eligibility criteria is tied to that Selective Service. When a guy turns 18, he's required to register with Selective Service if he was born a male and he was born on or after January 1st, 1960. So under the dislocated worker, there are 5 different categories. So it's kind of like your hand. I always reiterate this in-person training, is any one of these 5 ways a client can be eligible. And there's significantly different eligibility in each of these categories, and we're going to cover them all today in depth. Before we get into that, there's some key definitions that I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. These are underemployed, self-sustaining employment, and intervening employment. These are terms that are used a lot in dislocated workers, so I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page of what these mean. First, on underemployed. You'll notice the term underemployed is included in part of various WIOA dislocated worker eligibility criteria. Under WIOA, underemployed is defined as an individual who is working part-time but desires full-time employment, or who is working in employment not commensurate with the individual's demonstrated level of educational attainment. So that's the definition within the WIOA legislation and definitions. But Department of Labor expanded that even more so in that Teagle 1916. And in that they had also given guidance that if a client is working full-time, but they're on a form of public assistance, so food stamps or cash welfare or a medical card, then they should also be considered underemployed. So again, if a client is working a full-time job, but they're still on a form of public assistance, they should be considered underemployed. Also in Teagle 1916, they provided some additional guidance, and what that stated is any individual who meets WIOA low-income criteria but are working full-time are to be considered underemployed. Also, individuals who are employed but their current job earnings are not sufficient compared to previous job earnings from the previous employment, they could be considered underemployed. And this is very similar to a lot of local workforce areas' policy on self-sufficiency for a dislocated worker is tied to the percentage of a client's dislocation wage. An example could be a local area in their own local policy for dislocated worker could base the self-sufficiency on 80% of the layoff wage. So as an example, let's say you have a client who was laid off and he or she was making $50,000 a year. And if they found a job making $40,000 or above, then that would be 80% or more of the dislocation wage. So that's kind of a thought process that is going along with a determination of underemployed. And I'll expand on that in a little moment also. So self-sustaining employment, that is when a client has a job that meets the LWIA's definition for self-sufficiency. Again, as I'd mentioned under the dislocated worker title, an LWIA has the latitude to define self-sufficient employment based on a percentage of that dislocation wage, which I spoke about on the previous slide. And I use that example about the 80% that a local area could have as their own local policy. So using the example, if that client who had made $50,000 per year, and if the local area's self-sufficiency is 80% of that dislocation wage, if a client was got new employment making under $40,000 a year, so he or she would be under 80%, then that could be considered, it would not be considered self-sustaining employment. And then that is considered intervening employment. So again, intervening employment is when a client does not meet self-sufficiency criteria based on your local policy for a dislocated worker. So any local policy that establishes, and some establish 100% of a dislocation wage, some say 90%, some say 80%. So it's really important to understand what your local policy is on self-sufficiency for a dislocated worker. And if a client was a dislocated worker and they took a job making less than self-sufficiency, then you can still bring him or her in with their original eligibility criteria. And that's what this slide talks about. So to tie things together, if a client had intervening employment, they could also be considered underemployed. The client could still have consideration for eligibility under the dislocated worker program using the original dislocation job while working at intervening employment due to being underemployed. Lastly, on this topic, a client would be considered to be working in intervening employment at any job until they obtained self-sustaining employment. So I know that's a lot of information, and you don't have to understand it all right at once because it'll kind of get tied together as we're talking through the dislocated worker title and the different programs underneath it. So now let's get into the specifics of our different dislocated worker categories. As I mentioned, there are 5 different ways, and each of those has significantly different documentation requirements. Those 5 are unlikely to return to previous industry occupation, plant closure or substantial layoff, formerly self-employed, now unemployed, displaced tow maker, and spouse of a member of the armed forces on active duty. Out of those 5 different ways an individual could be determined eligible under the dislocated worker criteria, by far the most complex criteria is unlikely to return to previous industry or occupation. For this PowerPoint, we're just going to call it unlikely to return. So unlikely return has layered eligibility criteria, meaning there are several factors that will determine if an individual meets the criteria. The next several slides will cover this layered criteria. First, and this is right out of our own commerce policy, the individual has been terminated or laid off or received a notice of termination or layoff. The next, and this is where it starts getting, where some folks might get a little confused on it. This is how it's worded in our policy, and it states the classification of a person as eligible for unemployment compensation is limited to those who have been determined eligible to receive a monetary benefit by the State Unemployment Insurance Administering Agency, or who have been determined by a State Unemployment Insurance Administering Agency to have exhausted their benefits. So what this is basically saying is if an individual worked at a job that had paid into unemployment on his or her behalf, that they must be eligible to draw a monetary UI benefit or has exhausted their monetary UI benefit. So that's a big portion to understand for unlikely return. If a client was laid off from a job, it's their dislocation job, that had paid into unemployment on their behalf, they must be eligible to draw a monetary UI benefit or exhaust it. So in layman's terms, again, unlikely return, an individual who had paid in their job where the employer paid in, the client must be eligible to draw or exhausted. Traditional UI payments are received when an individual loses their job where the employer of record had been paying into the UI system on behalf of the clients. When an individual applies for UI, as long as the employer does not dispute the UI claim, the individual is able to draw the UI benefit while looking for new employment. Now, in the recent past, there's been a lot of information about the different UI payments. There's a Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, PUA program, that provides benefits for many individuals who have been determined ineligible for traditional unemployment benefits. Those are often folks who are self-employed, independent contract employees, who are probably the 2 of the most well-known groups of individuals who received that PUA. So for eligibility for the unlikely to return category, regardless if the individual receives or has received traditional UI benefits or the PUA benefits, are receiving or eligible to receive the monetary benefits but are not currently drawing, or have exhausted either their traditional UI or PUA, they would meet this portion of the eligibility. So that's good news. So if somebody is drawing or exhausted their traditional UI or drawing or exhausted their PUA benefits, they would meet this portion of the criteria. Where this is captured at is on the employment characteristics screen in the application in IWDS. So regardless if the person was on traditional UI or the PUA, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, you would still answer appropriately if they're eligible but not receiving benefits, if they exhausted it, or if they're receiving benefits. You would only respond not eligible, not determined if a person worked at a job who had not paid into unemployment, or if the person did not receive either pandemic nor traditional UI. So to recap, initial eligibility under unlikely return to previous industry occupation requires that the client be eligible to draw UI benefit, either traditional UI or PUI, or has exhausted either traditional UI or PUA that was covered in the previous slides. Now, there is one other alternative. In addition, there is an alternative for UI for individuals who worked for an employer who had not paid into UI on their behalf, and that's going to be covered in the following sections. And that's has been employed for a duration sufficient to demonstrate attachment to the workforce, meaning the individual must have worked at least 6 months employment in the industry or occupation from which he or she was dislocated, but is not eligible for unemployment compensation due to insufficient earnings or having performed services for an employer that were not covered under the UI law. So this is known as tenure. A really important thing to understand about the tenure, many of the jobs that traditionally would have met tenure have been eligible to draw that pandemic unemployment assistance. So again, many times people that would have met tenure have drawn or exhausted their PUA. And my wife's a good example. She's a hairdresser. She works for herself. She was never eligible for any UI benefits, but when they got everybody got shut down, she was eligible for the pandemic unemployment assistance. So again, many of the folks who traditionally would not meet UI and they would have been under tenure, they might have met that pandemic unemployment assistance. So within IWD, or within the WIOA Dislocated Worker Eligibility, there's that alternative UI, and it's called tenure. Tenure is for that individual who worked at a job or in the industry for at least 6 months where the employer did not pay into UI on behalf of the employee. And again, a point to understand, in the current situation, the majority of those individuals who typically would have met tenure alternative to UI are eligible or were eligible to draw pandemic unemployment assistance in many cases. However, if a client was dislocated from a job where they worked at least 6 months in the industry or occupation and the employer had not paid into the UI system on behalf and they were not eligible for PUA, that is when the alternative criteria of tenure should be indicated. And that's on the employment characteristics screen also, and it's a simple question, tenure. And you would answer yes to that if a person worked at a job who had not paid into unemployment and they'd been there at least 6 months, and they were not eligible for either pandemic or traditional UI. Below is a list of some of the jobs that prior to the pandemic that were typically tied to tenure. Churches or religious organizations, railroad, insurance agent, and don't think about like Big State Farm. I'm more talking about mom and pop small insurance agencies, private contractors, agricultural labor, domestic service, family businesses. And those are some examples. When I say family business, a lot of small family businesses, they do not pay into UI on behalf of their employers, the family members. So again, if a client worked at a job that did not pay into UI, but they received pandemic unemployment insurance, then it would be recorded just as they were receiving traditional UI. And as a reiterating, however, many of the individuals who previously had jobs that might not have met, or who might have met the tenure, might have possibly received that pandemic unemployment assistance. So next, it's very important to understand that under the unlikely to return criteria, if an individual is laid off, fired, quit, etc., from a job where the employer had paid into UI on behalf of the individual, and the individual has been denied UI benefits, the individual cannot be determined eligible under unlikely to return. There is no exception to this above paragraph. So if you have a client that comes in and he or she worked at a job and they'd been there over 6 months and they got let go or they quit and they were not eligible for traditional UI or PUA benefits, they would not be eligible under unlikely to return. You would need to look at probably the adult title. So now, if we have a client that has met the first part of unlikely to return criteria, which required the client to either be eligible for or exhausted UI, either traditional UI or PUA, or met the alternative called tenure, the next layer is looking at his or her dislocation job. Was that dislocation job from a low-growth industry based on the NASICs? Or was that dislocation job from a low-growth occupation based on the ONETs? Those are captured in IWDS on the dislocation job towards the bottom. You guys would populate when you're building the client's record, the NASIX for it, which is the declining industry, and the ONET, which is the low growth. In this example, the client's dislocation job was both declining and low growth. It's not required to be both, just one of the two. So again, it's a stair step. So the client first had to be laid off and then eligible to draw UI if he worked at a job that paid in or exhausted UI, or if he worked at a job that did not pay into UI, he had to have met the tenure criteria of working there 6 months. And then the next step was that dislocation job, either from a declining industry or a low-growth occupation. If the dislocation job was not from a declining industry or a low-growth occupation, then to qualify under unlikely return, there's also some additional criteria. Has the individual been unemployed at least 26 weeks and completed 1 month of job search? And that's through Illinois WorkNet typically, or through the IBIZ program. Well, where that is recorded, if the client, and again, this is only for a client whose dislocation job wasn't from a low-growth industry or a declining industry or a low-growth occupation. If they already met that portion of eligibility, you wouldn't need to mess with this long-term. But if their dislocation job was not from a declining industry or low-growth, that's when these two questions come into play that's on the dislocated worker characteristic screen. They need to both be answered yes for the criteria to be picked up, because it's a both, it's an and criteria. To meet this, they have to be unemployed 26 weeks and 1 month of job search. Just having one or the other would not meet the criteria. Lastly, if a client whose dislocation job was not from a declining industry, nor was the dislocation job from a low-growth occupation, nor was the client long-term unemployed, meaning 26 weeks with 1 month of job search, there is one last way for that client to meet unlikely return. And that's the question that's on the dislocated worker characteristic screen of require additional assistance. So where this comes into play again is if the dislocation job was not from a low-growth occupation or declining industry and the client had not been unemployed 6 months with 1 month of job search. What the whole paragraph speaks about of requires additional assistance is after an assessment of education skills and work experience have been determined by the Title 1B entity to require additional assistance to qualify for any available openings in the industry or occupation from which the person was laid off, or to obtain employment in another occupation. Such determination must be documented in the person's case file. So what this is talking about is if a client has a dislocation job that wasn't declining industry, it wasn't a low-growth occupation, why can't they go back to that job? And there might be a reason for it, and that's what this requires additional assistance comes into play. If you check yes to this, the only acceptable documentation is your assessment of why the client is not able to go back to his or her job or occupation that wasn't declining industry, wasn't low-growth occupation. You shouldn't mess with this question unless you need it, meaning if the client already has the dislocation job was from a low-growth industry or declining occupation, you wouldn't need to mess with this requiring additional assistance. You say that for those who do not meet those other criteria portions. Some examples of when required additional assistance might come into play could include, but are not limited to, an individual who has a medical or legal reason that they can no longer work in the field where they lost their job. An example is the CDL truck driver who has a medical or legal reason that prevents the individual from continuing to drive. So most truck drivers, if they get laid off, their job probably wouldn't be a declining industry or low-growth occupation, but if they could not go back to that job because maybe they had a DUI or some medical issues, then you would be able to justify that in your assessments. Another example of somebody who could be an individual who lost their job in high demand, but their current skill set is not up to date with the current job. An example could be a computer programmer who doesn't have the latest certification. So maybe he or she loses their job and they're trying to get a new job in the same field, but they don't have the most up-to-date certifications, so they can't get hired. So again, you as a career planner are able to justify this requires additional assistance. So it's really important to understand this alternative criteria under unlikely return is related to the question of required additional assistance to regain employment. would only be needed if the client's dislocation job is not from a declining industry or low-growth occupation, and if the client was not long-term unemployed, meaning 6 months unemployed with 1 month job search. One point to understand is the majority of dislocation jobs are probably going to be from either a declining industry or a low-growth occupation or both. And that's what you'll probably find when you're recording those jobs, or the dislocation job. So to recap, for unlikely to return, any client, they must first be eligible to draw a monetary UI benefit or exhausted benefit, and that could be either the traditional or the PUA, or if they worked at a job who had not paid into unemployment on their behalf, then they must have met the tenure criteria. And then after they've met that, the next step was the dislocation job from a declining industry or low-growth occupation? And if not, has the client been unemployed for 26 weeks with 1 month of documented job search? And if not, then you could have the required judicial assistance, which would be justified in the case notes as why the client was laid off from a job that was not declining industry or low growth, nor was the individual long-term employed, why he or she requires additional assistance. So this wraps up the dislocated worker eligibility for unlikely return to previous industry occupation. If you understand the ins and outs of unlikely to return eligibility, the rest of WIOA dislocated worker eligibility is really easy, because this is by far the most complex because it's so layered. So the next one we're going to talk about, much easier, plant closure or substantial layoff. An individual must have been terminated or laid off or received notice of termination or layoff from an employment due to a permanent closure or a substantial layoff at a plant, facility, or enterprise. With an IWDS, the logic for determining if a client meets the criteria as a dislocated worker under plant closure substantial layoff is based on the dislocation job from the edit screen, or edit job screen. Specifically determined based on how the layoff reason is populated. If either a plant closure or substantial layoff is chosen for the layoff reason, IWDS logic is going to make the client eligible as a dislocated worker, as long as he has a yes to primary occupation and a yes to dislocation. So here's an example. You have a client that was laid off on 6/1/20. If the layoff reason is plant closure, as long as it's the primary occupation and it's a dislocation, the client's going to be determined eligible as under plant closure. It's not going to look at eligibility criteria tied to UI. It's not going to look at eligibility criteria tied to declining industry or low growth. It's not going to be looking at that requires additional assistance. If an individual works at a plant or business that closed, they're going to be eligible, as long as they meet general eligibility, which is authorized to work and compliant with Selective Service. Same with substantial layoff. If a client has a substantial layoff, then there's going to be automatically determined eligible. If it's their primary job dislocation, there's no concerns for declining industry or low growth or UI status or requires additional assistance. It's all going to be based on their layoff reason. So plant closure or substantial layoff, an individual must have been terminated or laid off, as we spoke about, or if is employed at a facility in which the employer has made a general announcement that the facility will close within 180 days. That would also work for you. Often there are questions about what is a substantial layoff. Could be tied to 50% of employees, but could be broadened depending on the situation. As an example, if a company was running 3 shifts but closed down an entire shift, that might only equal 1/3 of employees, but could easily be justified as a substantial layoff. If you have questions about whether or not a client meets criteria as a substantial layoff, reach out to your supervisor or grant manager, or reach out to me on it. Here's my commercial on substantial layoff. A lot of stuff went on with the pandemic, and there's a lot of companies that laid off a large portion of their clients. In many cases, those are probably going to be considered substantial layoffs, because guess what? They're laying off a lot of employees. They're not bringing back folks. So if you're using substantial layoff for those companies that did lay the client off, you're not looking at whether or not the client was on unemployment or whether the dislocation job was low growth, declining industry. So again, many of those jobs where folks lost it due to the pandemic, substantial layoff, it might be an appropriate layoff reason there. Something to understand about plant closure substantial layoffs, and we'd already touched on this, there are no additional criteria tied to UI or tenure, or whether the job's declining industry or low growth, or whether it's a long-term unemployed or requires additional assistance. So again, plant closure substantial layoff, by far one of the easiest ways to qualify your client under dislocated worker criteria. Also, one last commercial about plant closure substantial layoff. Often, when you build a client in IWDS, you might see that he or she might be eligible for both plant closure slash substantial layoff and unlikely to return. I highly encourage you, if a client's eligible for both, just to certify under plant closure. That way you're not on the hook for all the documentation that's required for unlikely to return, because it's much more layered. There's much more chances of something going wrong with your documentation. So again, if a client's eligible as both plant closure or substantial layoff as well as unlikely to return, you don't have to certify in both titles, just certify under the plant closure or substantial layoff. Next one we're going to talk about is formerly self-employed, now unemployed. The criteria for this, the big thing to understand is it must be a primary job. I can't be DJ Jazzy Jim on the side and close my DJ business and still work full-time with the state and come in and get services. So it's got to be the client's full-time job. And then next, they have to lose that job due to general economic conditions or flood or natural disaster, or there's got to be proof that the business is failing due to financial reasons. It just can't be, hey, I didn't want to do this any longer, or I sold my business and now I'm going to go into something else and come in and have the local area or the grantee pay for the training. So the logic requires that the layoff reasons, general economic conditions, or a flood or natural disaster, or evidence of business failure. How it's recorded and determined in IWDS, it's on the edit job screen. Some of the things it must be is you have to have a primary occupation of yes and a dislocation of yes, and then self-employed must be populated, and then the layoff reason, as I mentioned, must either be general economic conditions or flood or other natural disaster. Or for businesses that had not yet closed, in the process of going out is the response for the one where the client's getting ready to have business failure and there's proof of that. So that's the internal logic for it. It's not a lot, so it's looking at self-employed, primary occupation, dislocation, and that layoff reason. Here's another small caveat that a lot of folks don't may not understand under the formerly self-employed, now unemployed. It also includes people who work for a farmer or a rancher or a fish hatchery. So a lot of times, especially during the COVID shutdown, a lot of farmers were laying off a lot of their farm hands. So those individuals could have came in under formerly self-employed, now unemployed. And I know some did, because I'd received some calls from some local areas after a presentation, and we walked through. And how it works for the logic on that is, again, the layoff had to be due to general economic conditions or a natural disaster. Well, COVID was considered a disaster, so that would work, but also economic conditions was relevant for that. The key is when somebody is working for a family member or farmhand is there's a question, family member or farmhand. So self-employed would still be populated with a yes if they're working for a farmer or a ranch or a fish hatchery, but you need to make sure you're checking that family member slash farmhand if that's appropriate, if the guy doesn't own, or the guy or gal is not the actual owner of the business. So next we're going to talk about is Displaced Tow Maker. Displaced Tow Maker is, it's really, the definition is for an individual to meet it, they must have been providing unpaid services to family members and who has been dependent on the income of another family member but is no longer supported by that income, and is unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment. So there's that underemployed that we spoke about earlier. So that's our definition. The internal logic in IWDS, it's just a simple question about displaced tow maker. If you put a yes in there, the eligibility logic in IWDS is going to make the client eligible. And it's based on you understanding this definition. So it's really important to understand this definition. In the WIOA legislation, they also put in a paragraph in the middle of that definition about people that are married to people that's in the armed forces. And then they, in the same legislation, they made a whole new category for for spouse of an active duty service member. So what you'll find on people that's in the military, married to folks in the military, often they might meet both the displaced tow maker as well as the spouse of an active duty service member. But since they have straight up eligibility criteria for the spouse of the service member, I encourage you to save the displaced tow maker for those that aren't military members, since you can use that separate category. So back to talking about this definition. People that come into mind when you're thinking about folks who might meet this category could be like a stay-at-home spouse where the primary breadwinner may have lost their job, or might have gotten divorced, or might have passed away. And then the stay-at-home spouse would meet this criteria, because now all of a sudden they've been dependent on the income of another family member, but they're no longer supported by income. And if they're unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment, then they would be eligible as a displaced tow maker. As I mentioned earlier, it's on the dislocated worker characteristics screen. This question is just displaced tow maker. If it's populated with a yes, the internal logic is going to make this client eligible. So it's really important to understand that definition that I passed on earlier. As I mentioned, some of the potential folks who could be eligible: unemployed or underemployed spouse who gets a divorce, separated, and cannot afford to get a divorce from the primary earner in the family; unemployed or underemployed whose spouse was the primary earner and passed away; unemployed or underemployed spouse where the primary earner in the family loses their job. Something was passed on about that last category in one of my classes in the last year was they've had a person that they had put in as a displaced tow maker based on the spouse had lost their job. Well, once they got the individual in services, then the spouse regained employment, and the client who they made a dislocated worker due to displaced tow maker no longer was interested in finding a job. So I would encourage you to make sure to ask that question, because you're kind of hamstrung if all of a sudden you've put somebody in as a dislocated worker and now they don't want to get a job because you're on the hook for your performance outcomes. So I would encourage you for the category where a spouse who lost their job and now the client is looking for coming in because he or she needs to find a job, to ask that question is, when your spouse gets rehired, are you still looking for a job? And not saying that you wouldn't put them in, but it should be a consideration of thinking it through the whole process of what's going to go on with this client's post-services employment. Documentation. A lot of times we get questions about documentation for a displaced tow maker, and it's going to be different depending on the circumstances, because there's no one set of circumstances. At the minimum, you know you're going to have the client's work history showing unemployed or underemployed. And then based on the scenario, you might need a court order if it's a divorce, death certificate if somebody passed away, a self-attestation for a marital status for somebody who could not afford to get a divorce, the layoff letter of a spouse if that's appropriate. So it's going to depend on the situation of what documentation you're going to need, but you want to support whatever's relevant for the client. But at a minimum, you know, you're going to have the client themselves work history, because they have to show that they're unemployed or underemployed. The last category, and it's the newest one under WIOA, it wasn't there for WIA, and it is that spouse of a member of the armed forces on active duty. Right now in Illinois, we have two large military installations, Sky Air Force Base down in Belleville, which is in OEA 24, and Great Lakes Naval Center up in Waukegan in OEA 1. They have a big advantage for this criteria because how it works, if you're married to somebody that's on active duty in the military, and if that spouse loses his or her job when they move to follow their spouse on active duty, that would make them eligible under the Spouse of Active Duty Service Member. The same, it doesn't even have to be effective with the move. The move is one if you lose the job, but if that spouse of the active duty service member is either unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment, they would be eligible also under the Spouse of Active Duty Service Member. Now, I said that Scott Air Force Base and Great Lakes Naval Center were the two largest, but also in this Spouses of Active Duty Service Member, most cities that have fairly large populations have military recruiters, so those are active duty military. A lot of the colleges that have ROTC units, those are active duty military. So anybody that's married, their spouse, if they're not employed or underemployed, they would be eligible under this criteria. So it's something for consideration for recruiting purposes. How it works in IWDS logic is there's a question on the dislocated worker characteristics screen that says spouse of an active duty service member. If that's populated with a no, of course the client would not have any eligibility tied to this. But if that spouse of an active duty service member is marked with a yes, then there's two other questions: employment loss due to relocation, or unemployed, underemployed, and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment. If the spouse is checked with a yes, and either one of those other questions are populated with a yes, the internal logic is going to make the client eligible under spouse of an active duty service member. The documentation for that, you need to have, of course, the ID that shows that they're active duty service member, and then it would be based, or spouse of an active duty service member, and then it could be based on the criteria. Maybe it's their transfer orders and their work history, or maybe if it's just unemployed, underemployed, it's just the client's work history alone. So to qualify for dislocated worker, spouse of an active duty service member, then either the spouse lost a job due to relocation or transfer, or if the spouse is unemployed or underemployed. And we just spoke about the minimum documentation, which would be that ID card that shows active duty military spouse, and then either transfer orders or their work history showing unemployed, underemployed. So this concludes the various ways an individual could meet WIOA dislocated worker eligibility criteria. Again, there are 5 ways the individual could meet the dislocated worker, and those are unlikely to return to previous industrial occupation. A big thing to understand about that is if a client worked at a job that paid into unemployment, he or she must be eligible to draw a monetary benefit or exhausted their benefits. If they received pandemic unemployment assistance, it would be recorded as the same as traditional dislocated worker UI payments in IWDS. And then the client must then either be, their dislocation job must be from a declining industry or low growth occupation, or they have to meet that long-term unemployed 26 weeks to 1 month job search, or the requires judicial assistance based on your assessment of why they could not go back to a job that was not low growth, declining, or long-term unemployed. The next one we talked about was plant closure or substantial layoff. Again, one of the most easiest ways to support eligibility. This has to be their primary job, dislocation job, and then if it's either a plant closure or substantial layoff, they'll be eligible. Formerly self-employed, now unemployed, that's tied to the client's primary job, and they had to have lost it due to general economic conditions or flood or natural disaster, and the pandemic, COVID pandemic is a disaster. Displaced Tow Maker, the criteria is that you're married to somebody who's been providing unpaid services and now you're no longer supported by their income, and you're unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment. And then the final is that spouse of an active duty service member. So if somebody's married to an individual on active duty in the military and they lost their job due to transferring duty stations, or in general, that spouse is just unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment. So this concludes the presentation on WIOA Dislocated Worker Eligibility. If you have questions, feel free to contact me at my email, or you can call me on my cell, or we can just ask the questions now. So are there any questions waiting for us, David?
We have one in the chat here. So in most cases, individuals that received PUA are eligible, and we should select what?
If you're selecting whatever's appropriate. So it's not necessarily eligible, they'd be eligible for the UI benefits. So if the client was drawing UI benefits due to PUA, then you would just be receiving UI. If they're exhausted their PUA, then it would be exhausted UI. But again, that's only eligibility criteria under the category of unlikely to return. If the client had lost his or her job due to a plant closure or substantial layoff, UI doesn't even come into play. So it's really important to understand these different criterias to make sure that you're only using what you need. So if it's unlikely to return, then that pandemic unemployment comes into play as well as regular UI. But you record that on that the employment characteristics screen, and if it's a pandemic, you'd record it just as if it was traditional UI.
Couple more that came in. What about a customer who receives a layoff letter from their employer and it's within 180 days before separation, and you enroll them 1D? You get them into training, and within a month of training services, the employer calls them back to work. Is that a disallowed cost?
Well, I'm not in the monitoring side, but this is some of my thought processes on that. Is when you have a client who has been laid off, or excuse me, who's been notified of layoff, you should be leaning more towards your career services than your training services, just for the case of what you just spoke about. Also, it's difficult for people to work full-time and go to school full-time. So what's going to happen when you're talking about disallowed costs, I'm sure the folks that's going to come in and look at it, they're going to see what was done in your assessments, what types of things did you use to support that the client needed to go into training right now prior to him or her getting laid off. And I'll give you, and it's a really good example, is let's say I was a person who got notified in December that my company was going to lay me off in April. And then this new semester is going to start in late January, and if I didn't enroll in that training now, I'd have to wait maybe till next September to enroll in training. So then it's something where a person can justify why we put this person into training while he or she was still working full-time. But overall, I'd always encourage you to just provide the career services until the person is laid off or really close to it, because it could happen just what you spoke about. Now on this, more than likely, as long as the assessment's is tight, it's probably not going to be a disallowed cost, I wouldn't think. But what you're going to run into is you're going to fail a performance measure tied to his or her credential, unless they're going to continue on to the work and go to school while they're working. And some people will do that. But as far as the disallowed cost, I'm not on the monitoring side, so I wouldn't make those type of calls. But that's some of the thoughts on folks who have been laid off and it's not the layoff hasn't came yet. I would really look more towards the career services, unless there's some outstanding reason why he or she could not go into, or the training is going to be right next to their actual dislocation. If they don't, they can't do it for 6 months or a few months. So those are just some of the thoughts on that. Any other questions? I'm having a hard time finding my appropriate PowerPoint. Are you seeing, David, the follow-up PowerPoint up there yet?
Well, not yet, but before that, there was one more question. If you could go back to the tenure page and re-explain.
All right. Bring that slide up. And tenure. All right. What do we want? What's the question? Just to explain it more in depth.
Yes.
Okay. So tenure is tied to if a person worked at a job that did not pay into unemployment. Now, typically, the jobs, like I mentioned, a lot of times are small business owners. A good way to know if somebody paid in unemployment or not, if you run an IBIZ check, if they've worked at a job for a number of years, you run an IBIZ check and there's no wages show up there. You know, that's a job that did not report wages to IDS. Examples I use, like railroad, they have their own UI system, so they're not going to draw a traditional UI. Small business owners, a lot of times if you work for not-for-profits or for churches, employees aren't eligible for UI. So if you work at one of these jobs that did not pay into UI, and you work there at least 6 months or in the industry, then you would meet the eligibility criteria for tenure, which is the alternative to UI. But again, what you're going to find, just due to current circumstances, most of the people who traditionally fell under tenure probably were eligible to draw that pandemic unemployment assistance. So if that's the case, then you wouldn't have to mess with tenure. But if a person worked at a job that did not pay into unemployment and they lost that job and they weren't eligible for pandemic unemployment insurance or traditional UI, which they wouldn't because they didn't pay into it, then as long as they worked there 6 months, then they would meet this alternative to criteria called tenure. And how it's recorded is on the employment characteristics screen, and it's only going to be for a client who is not eligible, not determined for UI, because if they're eligible to draw UI or exhausted UI, you couldn't meet tenure. It's the alternative for people who could not be eligible for UI because their employer did not pay in or they did not get the pandemic unemployment assistance. Did that answer that question?
We also have another question. Yes, that did look like it.
Okay.
Answered the question. Then there was one more. Should you use underemployed status anytime it applies, dislocated worker or adult?
It's not going to have a factor at all under the eligibility for the adult title. For the dislocated worker, where it comes into play, often it can come into play for a couple different things. For one, both the spouse of an active duty service member or displaced tow maker, because it's directly part of your eligibility criteria. But also it could come into play for traditional, the plant closure substantial layoff, the unlikely return, if a client has intervening employment, meaning that they're not up to self-sufficiency criteria for employment, so they might be underemployed because they're working just part-time jobs. But for the dislocation, you can still go back to that original dislocation job. So it depends on circumstances. It's you know, there's no one call for everyone because every eligibility is based on the client's individual circumstances. So when you say should you always use it, it's only eligibility factor for the dislocated worker if it's appropriate for the title. And for the adult, there is no eligibility set up for due to employment status. For the adult title, the eligibility is based on their circumstances. Are they on public assistance or low income, or are they basic skills deficient? Those things are where the adult priorities come into play. Answer your question. Any others?
There are no other questions right now.
All right, let me see if I can figure out how I can get my youth. There it is. All right, so on this new presentation, these are some things, if you're not familiar with, or if you haven't seen, that Commerce put out some new policies related to follow-up services that came out in June of 2020. So I'll show you where those are. We'll mention those, and make sure you take notes if you haven't seen these policies, to get yourself some copies of it. So the federal guidance and state guidance. First, the federal did both the Training Employment Guidance Letter 1916, which is provided for adult dislocated worker, as well as TEGL 2116, which is the youth guidance. Both are dated March of 17, and both are the most current DOL guidance on Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act eligibility, and both address follow-up. And then you have the state guidance, and the state has 3 different policies. You have Chapter 4, Section 2.4, which are just follow-up services, and it's going to be for all titles, adult dislocated worker and youth, and it was effective 6/18/2020. And then there's another Chapter 4, Section 2.4.1, which is adult and dislocated worker program follow-up services, that goes a little more in depth than the 2.4. And then that came out in March 12th of 2020. And then there's a Chapter 4, Section 2.4.2 for the youth programs, and it was effective 6/12/2020. So again, if you're not familiar with those state policies, I highly recommend you go on the e-policy manual and get yourself acquainted with those policies. So what the federal guidance states is that each state and local area must set up a follow-up policy. And what the Chapter 4, Section 2.4, it provides some really good guidance that a lot of times I have questions that came up. And to be honest, as a state, we haven't had the state guidance until recently, so I'm really glad we have it. But it says in the 2.4 that two-way communication could include telephone conversations, in person or via email or other social media could be considered two-way communication as part of follow-up. So as long as you're reaching out to the client and he or she's responding back, whether it's on the phone, it's in person, or email, or Facebook, you can use that as part of your communication and follow-up. This policy also reiterated that just sending a letter or leaving a voicemail for a client and them not responding, that is not an acceptable two-way communication to be recorded as follow-up. It's fine that you've done that and you can case note that, but you can't consider that as an episode of follow-up because you don't have that two-way communication. This policy guidance states that follow-up services may begin after the last date of service if the participant does not receive any other future services or there are none planned. So an example of this, if I'm your client and you've put me through training and I got myself a job and you're still in communication with me, at some point you decide that Jim's good to go, we're no longer going to serve him. So whenever your last service date to me is, you close out my services, then you automatically just open up my follow-up and follow-up begins. Now, a lot of times we're holding our exits for a little while to make sure Jim keeps his job, make sure everything's going fine, and we can hold it up to 90 days. A client can go 90 days without a service before he or she must be exited. So during that period of time, you would have been already conducting my follow-up. And then once a client is exited, the exit date always goes back to the last date of a real traditional service, not counting follow-up. So the exit date would go all the way back to the last actual service you gave me, and you a lot of times might have 2 or 3 months of follow-up already conducted. So what this policy states is that follow-up could be opened up after the last service is completed, and we'll demonstrate that in a moment in some screen slides. Other guidance in that Chapter 4, Section 2.4, which is the guidance for all titles, is responsibility of the career planner to determine in conjunction with the participant which follow-up services after exit would best suit the individual's circumstances. Now, some things to consider. At a minimum, for federal reporting and performance impact items related to post-exit employment, wages, education status, are to be considered on a quarterly basis, and they're especially important at the second and fourth quarter, as those are your most important time frames for performance outcomes. So you always want to make sure you're thinking about those types of things during follow-up. Now, other guidance in Chapter 4, Section 2.4, and this is something really important. These are little details that's really important to understand, because I've given this presentation yesterday to our monitoring team, and these are some of the things they're going to be looking for. In this policy, it states, at a minimum, the follow-up should occur every 30 days for the first 3 months, and then must occur once a quarter for the remainder of the 12-month period. And this aligns with quarterly post-exit reporting requirements. So again, if you're exiting a client, you're required every 30 days for the first 3 months to have some follow-up with the client. Hey, Jim, how's that job going that you got? You having any problems? You have any issues? So you're doing that. And then after your first 3 months, that's when you can change it up to once a quarter. At a minimum. But this is guidance that's in 2.4, the follow-up for all titles. So that's what when a monitor comes and looks through your file, they're going to be expecting for those first 90 days of your follow-up that you're doing it once a month. Follow-up activity must be recorded in IWDS throughout the required 12 months. A big thing to understand about follow-up is the service itself is opened in IWDS and left open until follow-up is concluded, but your actual follow-up actions are recorded within the case notes section or on the exit control panel, actually and/or, because a lot of times your follow-up might be recorded on the exit control panel when you're telling about their quarterly employment, and their wages, and their education status, if those things have changed. Now we'll get into the OET policy 2.4.1, which is specific on adult and dislocated worker follow-up. You know, in TEGL 1916, it requires that follow-up services must be provided for up to 12 months after the first date of employment for an adult or dislocated worker who obtains unsubsidized employment. However, if an adult or a dislocated worker client is still receiving traditional WIOA services, it's not possible to open follow-up. So I'm your client, and let's say I was still in training services, but I got myself a job. Well, according to the guidance in the TEGL, is you have to start my follow-up. Well, you can't, because you still have open services, and how IWDS works is follow-up can only be opened after all the traditional services are closed. So in those instances when a client enters unsubsidized employment while still enrolled in traditional WIOA services, the follow-up is included and recorded by the career planner and the staff in that routine two-way communication with the client. So you're doing that already. If I'm your client and I'm still going to school but I obtained my job, you're really asking about my job as part of just our communication. Hey, Jim, how's school going? How's your new job going? So you just record it there. That OET Chapter 4, Section 2.4.1, which is the specifics about adult and dislocated worker, it also spoke about recording the first date of employment and making sure that the follow-up is open. So again, if all my services have been completed, you want to make sure to open that up and begin that two-way communication about follow-up, and you're going to record that in the case note feature as all your actions that you have with the clients. Now here's something. Sometimes a client needs things, like let's say, you know, I'm your client and I'm exited and now all of a sudden I run into car problems. In the past, under WIA, a WIA would allow adults and dislocated workers to have supportive services while they're in follow-up. Under WIOA, it's not an authorized expense. So it is something that this is where we're going to probably need to have some referrals. Maybe we're in some contact with some other agencies who can maybe provide some of these services that we used to be able to provide to folks that were in follow-up that we can no longer do for the adult and dislocated worker. The ironic thing is for our youth clients that are in follow-up, we still can provide supportive services, but in the WIOA legislation, it was determined for adult dislocated worker that when they're follow-up, we couldn't continue to provide supportive services on the basis. So with that, what are the things we can do in follow-up for an adult or dislocated worker? So follow-up must be provided as appropriately related to counseling regarding the workplace to improve, assist with retention of the employment. Here's a list of activities that's mentioned in the policy 2.4.1. Counseling about the workplace, contacting individuals or employers to verify employment, contacting individuals or employers to help secure better paying jobs, assisting individuals, employers in resolving work-related problems, connecting individuals to peer support groups, providing individuals with information about additional educational or employment opportunities, and providing individuals with referrals to other community resources. So in lieu of being able to provide those supportive services that I spoke about for the adult or dislocated worker, that's where I encourage you to try to find some community resources that might be able to help with those types of issues if it comes up while the client is in follow-up. Now, OET provides that specific feedback in that 2.4.1. If after 90 days following exit, if a participant is not responsive, cannot be located, refuses to provide information, the career planner may close out follow-up services. When this is done, it must be case noted, and the IEP must document the reason for the discontinuation of the follow-up services. And you would have that word picture showing that. If you've been trying to get a hold of the guy or gal when you're conducting follow-up and they're not responsive, they're blowing you off, it gives you the latitude after 90 days to close the follow-up and then record as appropriate in your notes of the actions. Now, how about this one? It will require that if a client is an adult or dislocated worker, if they obtain unsubsidized employment, we must conduct follow-up. In instances where adult dislocated worker does not obtain unsubsidized employment upon completion of traditional WIOA services, follow-up services should be made available. Now, when you understand that the client is still going to be tracked for federal reporting and performance outcomes for 12 months post-exit, it makes perfect sense to stay engaged with the client and attempt to assist with gaining self-sustaining employment. So there is a benefit for you to keep in contact with that client and provide those follow-up even if they didn't get a job, because you're measured on his or her post-exit employment and the wages that they're in and retaining that employment. So if they didn't have a job after completion of services, we still want to help them as much as possible. If individuals who do not obtain unsubsidized employment and they decline follow-up services, the policy, Chapter 4, Section 2.4.1 states it must be documented in the case notes and or the individual employment plan that the client denied or declined follow-up. Now let's speak about the youth. So the youth, again, we have Chapter 4, Section 2.4.2, so it goes more in depth. And it says follow-up services are critical services provided following a participant's completion of WIOA services to help ensure their success in employment and or post-secondary education and training. The goal of follow-up services for youth is to enable participants to continue lifelong learning and achieve a level of self-sufficiency to ensure job retention, wage gains, and post-secondary education and training progress. One of the things for follow-up services must be made available to a youth for a minimum of 12 months. Youth follow-up may include, but are not limited to, the following program elements: supportive services. If funding is available and the need of supportive services are supported in the individual service strategy for the client. So when you're thinking about the follow-up supportive services for a youth client, this wouldn't be a plan that we're going to fund his or her transportation all the way through follow-up or pay for his or her child care all the way through follow-up. This would more be if some issues arise that you could help him or her with whatever circumstances they're dealing with. That's when the supportive service might come into play. Their car breaks down, and maybe all they need to keep that job is just some assistance to help them get to and from work for a few weeks. So maybe you can get the bus passes. So whatever's appropriate. So when you're thinking about these supportive services, it wouldn't be it'd be more of emergency. It wouldn't be you continuing to really serve the client. If that's the case where he or she needed to continue serving, you wouldn't have exited them. You'd just continue to serve them. Other opportunities for activities that could happen during a youth follow-up: adult mentoring, financial literacy education, services that provide labor market and employment information, activities to help youth prepare for and transition to post-secondary education and training, and then other services necessary to ensure the success of the youth in employment and or post-secondary education. One of the things about your youth, and you guys work with the youth, if you're on this, you know way better than I, if a client's exited, if he or she is working at the second quarter post-exit, or if they're in post-secondary education, either one is a positive outcome. And the same at fourth quarter post-exit, if they're working and or going to post-secondary education, it's a positive outcome. So if you're not doing your follow-up, it'd almost be impossible to know about that post-secondary education, because it's not like you can rely on IDS to auto-populate a job. You can't do that with schools. So it's really essential for the youth to make sure you're engaged with those clients in case they do go into a post-secondary education, that you can make sure we can record that so you can get credit for the work you put in to help them to get to that point. One of the things that, and it's reiterated in Chapter 4, Section 2.4.2, the final regulations and rules under WIOA allow youth to decline follow-up services altogether. However, when that occurs, it should be the exception, not the rule. Meaning if you're finding all of your youth are declining follow-up, there's something wrong with our process, because being part of a youth in WIOA, it's understood that once we get through services, that the client is part of the services is 12 months following up afterwards. You know, you spend a lot of time and energy with a youth, sometimes several years, and if all of a sudden they get done with services and we just cut ties with them, we're leaving a lot of things out to chance, because as I mentioned, post-secondary education, if you're not in contact, how are you going to know if they're moving on to that? Their employment, maybe they don't have a traditional job. Maybe they're working for somebody that's not reporting wages through IDS. So it's really important that we're staying in contact to assist them if there's any issues, but also to make sure that you're getting full credit for what's going on with the client post-exit. On this, in that policy, Chapter 4, Section 2.4.2, it did give guidance on unable to contact. If a client's unable to contact, then you would not have to put him or her in follow-up. You'd want to make sure you're recording that in the case notes. Opting out of the 12 months follow-up period may occur at any point in time. The request to opt out or discontinue a follow-up services must be clearly documented in the case notes. And again, career planners should not promote youth to opt out of follow-up. I can tell you one of the things, and this is both for federal data validation and for monitoring, a question that comes up: was the youth enrolled in follow-up? That's a question that comes up for every question or for every client. If the answer is going to be no, well then the monitor, or in data validation, we dig in further to see why did they decline it. So again, it should be the exception. It shouldn't be happening to a large number of your clients. So now we're going to demonstrate what I spoke about earlier after the last service is completed and opening up follow-up. So here's an example client out of our training database of IWDS. The client completed their occupational classroom training on 5/20/2020, but they were still in other services, getting case management, and they had their IEP updated, and their last official service was on 6/30/2020. For this example client, as I mentioned, that service is on 6/30/2020, so the actual start date of follow-up could be recorded on that same last date of service, or you could open it up on the day after the last day of service. In this example I'm demonstrating, I opened up on that same date, 6/30/2020. As I've mentioned, when we open up the service, that's all you do with the official service. You just open it up, and then it's going to show as maintaining open. The true follow-up, the actions taken as part of follow-up, is recorded in your case notes and when appropriate on the exit control panel. So here's an example of my client, and he, or in this case, it's a Mr., and he completed his training, and then he got a job on 6/1/2020. He received his first paycheck, and then now he is in follow-up services. So as the requirement was, I would be following up with him once a month for the next 3 months, and then after that once a quarter, and that's per the new policies that's put out by Commerce. So the guidance on frequency, as we just touched on, again, is often as necessary throughout the required 12 months, but at a minimum occur at least every 30 days for the first 3 months, and then must occur once a quarter for the remainder of the 12 months. And this aligns with those quarterly post-exit reporting requirements. One other point that I really want to make sure, and it's reiterated on both the 2.4.1 and 2.4.2, which is the specific information about adult dislocated worker and youth. In that policy, it requires that local areas establish their own policy on frequency of follow-up. So your local area can never make it less stringent than what's in the state policy, which is a minimum of every 30 days for the first 30 days and then once a quarter afterwards. But maybe they'd have other more restrictions. Maybe they'd require you to do it more often, but that would be in the local policies. So 2 different things. You should be familiar with the Commerce policy, and then you should be familiar with what your local policy states also. And do remember one important thing, after the 12 months of follow-up has been completed, to go in and close that follow-up service. Sometimes monitors will contact me and let me know, hey, if we're in across the issue where a follow-up service was still left open and the client's been exited, a year or a couple years. So it's important just to go back in and close out that follow-up service once your 12 months of follow-up has been completed. So this PowerPoint discussed the WIOA legislatively mandated follow-up and demonstrated the steps required to record follow-up service within IWDS. If you have questions related to recording the service of follow-up or anything in this PowerPoint, feel free to contact me at my email, or you can call me at my cell phone number, which is 217-416-7097. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions. We have about 14 minutes, so we're setting good on time. So any questions? David.
Yeah, there's one we have here. I don't even think youth know that they can deny follow-up services. With youth, should we inform them they have the right to deny follow-up if they don't feel they need it?
I would never bring it up, because let me tell you, if a youth's attitude could be, yeah, I don't want you to follow up, but it is something that's really needed. I mean, especially for that youth title. If you just think about, we've been helping them and we've been giving them services, and then all of a sudden they exit, and then we just cut bait with them. So I would say that those who are opting out more for those who basically have no longer want contact with you. Because if they're still engaged, I wouldn't even bring up opting out. Opting out should be the last recourse, because if we start having a lot of opt-outs, what you're going to find is your performance is going to start tanking, because especially with that youth title, your measurements are what's going on second quarter and fourth quarter. Well, that's all titles, but the youth, post-secondary education is really, really, really important, equal to having a job. So if you're not conducting follow-up, how are you going to know if he or she does go on into post-secondary education? So I would never encourage it. I'd never even bring up opt-out. I mean, if they choose to be the type of client that no longer wants to interact with you, well, then you can use the opt-out. But that's just kind of my thought process on it.
If an adult dislocated worker client has been working 12 months while also in training, do we need to open up a follow-up services line at all?
Yes, you'd still want to do that, just because you're measured on performance outcomes for 12 months. So let's say he or she's been working that 12 months and everything's going along job, but still stuff happens. And if you're not engaged with this client, and then all of a sudden they lose his or her job, and all of a sudden second quarter comes, and maybe there's something you could have done, and we weren't there because we've lost contact with him or her. So if they have that, I would still encourage you to provide that follow-up. But per the legislative, it's still going to be required, because they're going to be exited as unsubsidized employed. So you're still going to be required to do it. But I mean, I'm telling you, if we cut bait and stop doing this follow-up, you're basically leaving your performance outcomes on chance, because you're not there to do anything to help a client if he or she runs into any problems during. You're just relying that, well, if they have any problems, they'd call me. And a lot of times people, they get it going with their life, and then they think, woe is me, and something happens, and then they just kind of give up. And sometimes we're the cheerleader just to help him or her get back on their feet, or if they have a bad day at work. So I'd encourage you to still conduct that follow-up.
And at this time, there are no other questions in the chat.
No problem. If you ever have questions, like I said, you feel free to send me an email on it. I would really encourage you to make sure to get these new policies that have came out and have the copies, read them over, make sure you understand what they're talking about, what they say. Don't just rely on this PowerPoint that I'd put together, because there's a lot of content in these commerce policies, and I kind of picked the information out, but I didn't cover everything, of course, in these. So I encourage everybody to get your own Chapter 4, Section 2.4, Chapter 4, Section 2.4.1, and Chapter 4, Section 2.4.2. So thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate it, and have a great remainder of the day.